guys, and thanks for joining us again tonight for Broken Heroes. We are about to wrap up this series, and we're looking at the life of Paul. We started last week, so this is Paul Part 2, and we have been through the Old Testament. We have journeyed through the New Testament now. One more week, we're going to look at John the Revelator next week to close things out. But tonight, we're going to talk about Paul one more time, and Pastor Adam, why don't you tell us where we're headed tonight?
Paul is one of probably the second most influential men in all of Christianity behind Jesus, and so we could go on and on about Paul. But last week we broke down kind of his conversion. They broke down the name change and everything, and this week we're kind of looking at his calling, his mission on life. As he transitions to Paul, God gives him a calling, and this is pretty much the rest of his life. His journey is his calling, and it's done. And there's three different ways there's three different missions trips he takes, and you kind of break it down that way, and you look at what he is. So I guess what we want to talk about, kind of about what his calling was, Pastor. If you could quickly kind of break down what his calling was, what made his calling different than Peter's calling, than James's, and then John's calling.
Okay, so right before we get there, maybe we should kind of rehash his brokenness. You want to tell us a little bit about what we talked about last week, how he was broken?
Yeah, he was once formerly known as Saul. He was a persecutor of Christians because he believed that they were not honoring God in how they were worshiping God, because he believed Jesus was simply a man and not the Messiah. And so on the road to Damascus, he's blinded by a light, and Jesus speaks to him and asks him, why does he persecute him? And at that point, he is blind for 3 days. And as we talked about a few weeks, Ananias was given a vision to go and see Paul to basically heal him of the blindness. And from that point on, once he received a sight, metaphorical and literal, he now is a savior of Christians and is now preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Okay, so that kind of tells us a little bit about his brokenness. He thought he was doing the right thing, and I guess that kind of brings us back around to some of his mission, that he thinks that he is called to the Gentiles, whereas the mission that Peter, James would have had, and John would have had to been to the Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And so you have these two distinct groups that Paul feels like. I don't think he's exclusively feels like his only message is to Gentiles, but he thinks that his message is to
include the Gentiles
into this discussion, into this journey with Jesus. And so, yeah.
I think, Paul's life is hard to kind of break down because, it's 13 books. Paul writes 13 books. He is, there's 6 assassination attempts on his life. He's shipwrecked 3 times, according to, what he writes. It's such a huge story here. You kind of have to have an understanding of all the books, an understanding of what happens here in all the missionary journeys to truly understand what he's doing compared to the others. They're all doing what God's called them to do, but Paul really has this desire, like his pastor said, to bring in the Gentiles. Now, the Gentiles, Justin, what were, again, just so people understand, what were the Gentiles compared to the Jews? What were Gentiles?
Gentiles was everyone who wasn't Jewish.
Right, which at the time is a big deal because the Jewish religion was very exclusive just for Jews, and if you were a Jew that had bad things or stuff in your life, you really couldn't get to the temple. You really couldn't partake in Judaism, and now Jesus is opening it up to everyone.
Now, there was a way, though, for people who could be converts to Judaism. I think there was a word, the Greek word was theosebis, which basically means God-fearer. So if you were a God-fearer, you could be part. You could come close enough but you couldn't be full-fledged.
Right, you're giving up a lot. You're really giving up your identity. You're giving up your family. You're giving up all your stuff to do this. Now, Christianity, when as Jesus brings it into everyone, is not that way. You know, they don't want you to give up your identity as a Gentile. Jesus is including them in there. And the interesting part, and what Pastor Ryan I know wants to talk about, is in between the first and second journey, his missionary journeys. His first journey, he starts in Antioch. They travel. It's his smallest missionary journey out of all the journeys. And he goes, him and Barnabas go and they plant churches. They go and they're spreading the gospel. They're spreading to the Jews and the Gentiles. They're spreading the good news. And what they're doing is they're converting people to Christianity. And what they're doing is really weeding out a lot of the pagan religions at the time, pulling out a lot of the things that were very Greek or very Roman, and trying to narrow down, like, this is what Christianity, because Christianity at the time was infused, maybe the right word, with a lot of other things. Sometimes they adopted some pagan ideas.
Yeah, I would say that anytime someone came to Christ, they brought their own baggage with them. You know,
Right.
They brought their own traditions with them. So you could be coming from, you could be raised a Jew and have a lot of your tradition that you're still wanting to impose on your walk with Christ. You could even go the opposite way, though, if you're coming from the other side of things, where you're coming from a pagan background, where you have all these beliefs, all these deities that you've worshipped, and what you think they need, what you think that these deities want, and you can bring that baggage with you as well, and it starts coloring your walk with Christ in a sense. And so I think that's some of the stuff that they have to address, on both sides. What does that look like when you address traditions of the Jewish people and then the traditions of those who are pagans?
And I think that's like the key word in all this is traditions. Paul is on a journey to break down traditions from both sides, from the Jewish side and from the Gentile side, and really just focus on Jesus, this is a very new concept to these people. This is I don't want to say new religion, but it's new to people. They're not, understanding having one God is it's a weird mindset to most of the Romans. Like he said, they're polytheistic. They serve multiple gods. So he's really trying to stop traditions and break it down. But what we said, he starts in Antioch. He does his first missionary journey, and he ends in Antioch. And there is a meeting in Antioch that, if you could be a fly on the wall now, especially as like a Bible nerd, it would have been awesome to be there. Because there are, it's all the who's who of the time. It's Paul, it's Peter, it's James, it's John, it's all these people. And they start talking about what actually matters in Christianity, which is, at the time, they're trying to stop tradition, weed out all the important stuff and focus on what matters. And what was the argument there?
Well, I know that, once again, when you talk about these traditions, when you're coming from the background, there are certain things that as you're raised, it's difficult to let go of.
Which we have them too. We have traditions here in our world, yeah.
Yeah, and so there may be certain things. It reminds me of a story that a lady who, I hadn't told the story in a while, but it reminds me of a story of a lady who, her mom had taught her how to bake Christmas ham. And so the lady would take the ham, and she got married, she got a ham, she cut off both ends of the ham and put it in the oven. She threw the two good ends of the ham away, and her husband just looked at her and said, "Why are you doing that?" She's like, "Well, my mom cooked the ham like that." And so the guy went and asked the mom, he's like, "How do you cook a ham?" She's like, "Well, I take and cut the two ends of the ham off, and I throw the ends of the ham away, and I put it in the oven." He's like, "Why do you do that?" She's like, "Well, that's how my mom cooked the ham." And come to find out, goes and talks to the grandmother, and the reason that she did that was because the oven that they had was too small to fit a whole ham. So it's these things, these traditions sometimes that we pick up, we don't know why we do certain things, kind of carries over, and so I think you have some of that there's these traditions that have carried over, that some things that they believe that are not necessarily in Scripture, but it's part of their Jewish tradition. And it becomes a hindrance to the gospel. It becomes a hindrance to their walk with Christ.
What it really ultimately, it was adding a lot of loopholes that the Gentiles were having to jump through to become Christians. And to some of their minds. And the argument really, not the argument, but the disagreement was between Paul and Peter. And Justin, if you could speak on for a minute a little bit what the disagreement really was about, just in the context of tradition, in the context of what we were talking about.
Well, after Paul receives he received a vision. That's found in Acts chapter 10. Peter was one of the first apostles that he went and talked to, and it basically, in a nutshell, Peter thought that the Jewish Christianity was a superior group of people as opposed to the ones that Paul was was converting.
Okay, I would. He's getting this revelation. I think once again, Peter's getting this revelation of this vision, and it's challenging what he's always believed. And basically in this vision, he gets this message from God. He says, "What I call clean, don't you call unclean." And so, it challenges him and forces him, and we see this later on, and where Paul opposes Peter. And let me read this for you in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. And it says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." So Barnabas was a traveling companion of Paul, who was actually almost a mentor of Paul of sorts. And so even he falls into this trap that Paul begins to see play out. So was led astray by their hypocrisy. In verse 14 of Galatians chapter 2, it goes on, it says, "But when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel," the truth of this good news that he's bringing, "I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" So he's basically calling him out. He's saying there's a double standard here. There's something going on there. You're not the same. It's this play acting thing that's happening. He calls him out.
Peter, for lack of, just to break it down very simply, was bringing all this extra baggage to the Gentiles that they had to do. A lot of the Jewish customs, a lot of the Jewish traditions that they had to do before they were becoming what he would consider, a Christian. And Paul was breaking that down. So as Paul was out in Asia, when you read Asia in the Bible, it's not Asia. It's Turkey. For reference, they're not in China, but they're more or less in Turkey. And he's over there, and he's breaking off traditions, breaking off all these things. And he after 14 years, he goes back to Antioch, and he meets with these people, and he sees that they've fallen into the same trap that he's breaking off. He's trying to say, it's not about these things. It's not about all these, my old youth pastor said, I remember he always said, you don't take a bath before you take a shower. And there's a lot of times they're trying to get him to do all these things before they get to Christ. And Paul's just saying, no, just come to Christ. Like, it doesn't matter what you are. Like, all this tradition, all this stuff doesn't matter. Just come to Christ. Just the good news, come here. God can change you. And there's faith and there's hope and there's all these things. And Peter is falling into these traps. They're not bad. No one's saying Peter was doing anything wrong.
I think he thought he was actually trying to be sincere in a way that it's part of how he was raised, part of his DNA
right.
in a sense. But a lot of things that we're raised believing, sometimes we can get challenged on as we get closer and closer to Christ. That's not a bad thing. Actually, I think that's part of our faith journey, and that's the best part of our faith journey, is that some things that we take for granted, maybe that, well, so-and-so told me this, and we grow up with bad ideas. The closer we get to Jesus, the more we see the truth of the gospel, and we say, man, that doesn't look like Jesus at all. And so it challenges us, if we want to be Christ-like, it challenges us sometimes to drop traditions that become hindrances later on in life.
And what I like about this is that they argue, and we don't know how bad they are. We use this word argue, and they just disagree. And do they ever come to an agreement? Justin, do you think they come to an agreement here?
I think it's probably more of a agree to disagree type situation. I don't think they see eye to eye on a lot of it.
Yeah, they very much are. Just say, okay, eh, we'll go. Oh, you go your way. I'll go my way. Paul does call out Peter as pastor. You say he calls him out and he says, "You're doing this when we're here, but you're not doing this when other people are here." Like we've been told, like when you're around Gentiles, you act like Gentiles. When you're around Jews, you act like a Jew. And now all of a sudden, you're trying to hold these traditions. He calls them out, and they end up parting ways, for lack of a better word. You want to stay on this for a minute, Pastor?
Well, I want to jump over to Galatians chapter 5, because if you look at the beginning of Galatians chapter 5, and I think Paul really gets to, the heart of what he's saying here. He goes on to verse 1 here in chapter 5, and he says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." So he begins to draw these analogies that, hey guys, you've been living under a certain type of bondage and slavery. Yeah. You don't have to walk like that. It's not true freedom when you have all these things that get laden to your walk with Christ. And I think sometimes that even happens now for Christians. Yeah. We add stuff to what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Christ follower. Well, maybe that's not really what it means. Maybe that's just what you think it means. Maybe that's just your brand of Christianity, that you have to dress a certain way to come to church. You have to sing a certain style of music, and so you can add stuff to that may look good, but what it does is it begins to become a hindrance. Or using Paul's words, it becomes a yoke of slavery, and it goes against the freedom that we have in Christ.
Yeah, I think some of even the modern traditions we have now that we've gathered over the years as church people, like you were saying, we got to dress a certain way. You can't go to a movie. You can't, all that was stuff that I grew up hearing. And I know my parents grew up. You couldn't go see a movie. You couldn't go and hang out at a certain time. At nighttime, you couldn't play cards and all that kind of stuff.
I knew people who couldn't go to football games.
Yeah, I mean, it's these traditions that I think has held people in bondage. That even now, people think that there's, I don't know. It's like what verse 1 says: "Is for freedom Christ has set us free." We don't have to live under that stigma of you can't do this, you got to work yourself to death to earn your salvation and to keep your salvation and all that. I just, I think that if we take the scripture as it says and just, not succumbing to the yoke of slavery or in that bondage, it gives us a sense of freedom.
Now I would ask this question now, because we're right here in Galatians and Paul's talking about us for freedom. Christ has set us free. Can that pendulum swing way far the other way, where we begin to abuse freedom?
Oh, absolutely.
Our freedom in Christ. Did he ever address that anywhere?
I mean, I'm not sure if it's in Galatians. He says everything's permissible, but not everything is beneficial.
Corinthians.
Yeah, and so I think we can go the other. We can take it. Well, Jesus saved my life, or He's given me freedom, so I can just do what I want to do, and everything's going to be okay. When in actuality, you could really do a lot of damage if you expend your freedom too much.
So,
I think Paul's main issue here is he comes from a Jewish background where only one person could enter the King of Kings. Only one person could enter the presence of God, and the Holy of Holies, and they could enter that thing, and even then, there are a lot of times that person might have died, or there was sin, there had to be sacrifice done. There's all these things where then Jesus dies, the veil is torn from top to bottom, and now everyone can enter the Holy of Holies. And there's a difference where Paul has a legit experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus, which before that did not happen. There was no personal connection to Jesus. And now Paul has that, and his mission in life is to teach everyone out that personal connection, that they individually can have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And then he gets back to this group of believers, and they're throwing on things that make it harder to have that relationship. And so he's sitting down and saying, no, let's cut off these things. And right now, yes, I know he talks to Timothy. They talk about grace. He talks about, the pendulum might swing a different way where you can abuse grace, and in Christianese we call it sloppy grace. But right now he's focused on the simple fact of let's not burden people with trying to get to Jesus, because all my life I had a religion where I could not get to him, and now we're free. Now we can get to him. Let's get to him. And that's the argument he's having with Peter here. And the disciples, like, do not make this hard for these people. Do not make it. If you want to make it hard for me, I'll jump through every hoop. And he does. He jumps through the hoops to make sure that he's a good, he follows all the Jewish customs and he follows all the Christian customs. But he says, don't make it hard for people in Greece. Don't make it hard for people in Turkey. Don't make it hard for these people because they don't know better. And I just want them to experience Jesus. So they have this disagreement here. And that's the thing. And to answer your question, yes, I think we can have sloppy grace. We can abuse freedom. And that without relationship, you can always abuse freedom.
If you go a little bit farther down in that same chapter, Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, this is what it says. He says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So we can be a slave to tradition. We can also be a slave to our own selfish desires. And it's almost this thing of he's really going to hit both sides throughout his epistles that he pens to these churches, these letters that he pens to these churches. He's going to speak to Jewish Christians who are struggling with this. Okay, what does this look like? And he's just, once again, he's going to hit these pagans who are coming in, and it looks very different on their side. What does this new walk in Christ look like? And so he's going to hit both sides of that. But yeah, I think in conversation with Peter and his disagreement there, it would have been more about the traditions and hypocrisy.
So so they argue, they disagree. He takes Barnabas. He goes on a second missionary journey, and that's the longest one at that point. And he completes it. And then he has a third one, and we could get very much in the weeds of where he goes and what he does in each one. And there's books, all the books are written, and then but what I kind of like about this is kind of what we talked about at the very beginning, like the price he paid to do these things. We talked about he got shipwrecked 3 times. He got bitten by a snake. There was 6 assassination attempts on his life. There is. He's jailed, He all these things happen for him to complete this journey. And what man, I get discouraged sometimes and I want to quit. I get fed up with life, or when life doesn't go the way I want it to go, I just want to stop sometimes and well, it must not have been God. Like it wasn't easy. It must not be God. And you look at this man, and not just him, but the people with him, and the price they paid and what they sacrificed to go out and change the world.
I think there was a lot of wins also. With the down thing. I know he had a lot of down luck situations go on, but it also the Bible talks about in Acts all the different miracles that was done by his hands. Like you said with the snake, that he got bit by a snake and nothing happened. He helped a guy receive his sight. He ridded someone of an annoying spirit, or the spirit of someone that was annoying him. I think we all could think of somebody we wish we could do that with. But also too, it healed a man with fever, and I think with all the bad luck or the bad things that happened to him, I think the things that probably kept him motivated and kept him going was knowing that those other good things was happening, those miracles was taking place, and he was actually making a difference. But it's easy to quit or want to quit whenever things aren't going your way. Being shipwrecked. Yes, Tom Hanks looks hopeless when you're shipwrecked.
Everybody needs a Wilson.
Everybody needs a Wilson.
I don't know if Paul had a Wilson or not, but he probably had better than a Wilson. He had the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So we're good on that. All right.
I guess to close out Paul, him and Nero get into it. Nero wins. He gets beheaded around like 73 AD, something like that, 67 AD, I think, if I remember right. And it's not in the Bible how he dies, but it's an extra literature. Yeah, it says he died the same way John the Baptist died, and so you go on, and he lived roughly the same time as Jesus, but they never met besides that dream. But he goes on and takes this, and he changes the world. Before he succumbs to Nero, which a lot of people succumbed to Nero at that time. Nero he really didn't like Christians, and he would go and from time to time go raid house churches, steal their money, and he would build the Colosseum. He'll fund the Colosseum, which then they put Christians in the Colosseum, which is a horrible way for all to happen. But over and over again, Paul goes out and he changes the world, and he does it on after all these setbacks, after everything. He just makes it free for people.
But, I think all that comes, though, when we go back to last week, and just that conversation of his experience that he had with Jesus. That experience of meeting Jesus at that moment, where Jesus changes his life, begins to change his mentality. If you look at Galatians chapter 1, he talks about going down after his after his experience with revelation with Jesus. He goes down into Arabia for 3 years, and basically he's just learning. He's learning. And I think he's learning from Christ, learning, what this looks like. And so that experience is one that drives him, and to share and to not push people away, but that message of Jesus gives you the invitation to come close. God gives you the invitation to come close and come walk with him.
Knock you off your donkey.
Anything else? You want to close us out?
Yeah. Next week we're doing John. Thank you for listening.
The Revelator.
We'll see you Sunday.
Don't forget 2 services Sunday.
Yeah.
Two services Sunday, 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. If you will, go reserve your seat because there are limited seats right now for these 2 services. We've only got about 50 seats per service. And so it's really important if you want to come to reserve those seats so that we can make sure that we're following within social distancing guidelines. But we would love to see you. And
They're filling up fast, too. They're filling up faster than they did last week.
They are. They're filling up faster than they did last week. So go to newliferh.com, and you can reserve your seat there. God bless you guys.
Good night.